Meanwhile, Camilla was at home, not realizing Max had returned. The next morning, Franklin asked her about his missing clothes and car. They eventually came to the grim realization that Max had likely seen them together. Panicked, they discussed calling the police, but worried it would reveal the affair. Max, meanwhile, drove to Franklin's house using the address from the license, hoping to confront him. When he arrived, a young woman, likely Franklin's wife, opened the door. After a tense conversation, she let him in. They shared coffee, and Max explained the situation. Sitting in New York airport was not the most pleasant way to spend an evening, Max thought, as he watched the boarding process for what he hoped would be his flight home to Charlotte. Max, along with his two sisters, owned a small pharmaceutical company created by their father several decades earlier. His father had developed valuable, but rarely used drugs that kept the company profitable but never offered much room for growth. After his parents passed, Max had spent the last few days in New York negotiating the sale of the company to a major pharmaceutical firm. Today, Max and his team of lawyers and brokers had closed the deal and left the paperwork for the lawyers to finalize. Max hoped he'd make it home tonight, but it looked unlikely. The last flight to Charlotte was fully booked, and he was third on the waitlist. He hadn't called his wife, Camilla, since he didn't know what to tell her. So, he sat at the bar, where he could keep an eye on the gate, sipping his second gin and tonic as he thought about the deal and the money he and his sisters would soon share. The amount was something over $10 million for him, plus a well-compensated transition period with Big Pharma, which meant a new lifestyle for him and Camilla. Their twin girls were already out of the nest or close, both juniors at Duke University, where tuition was practically eating him alive. But all that would change when the pharmaceutical deal closed. Meanwhile, the boarding process was ending, and gate agents were letting the last passengers on the plane. Then, a small miracle happened. The boarding sign changed, and Max saw his name appear on the waiting list. He tossed money on the bar, waved to the bartender, who gave him a thumbs up, grabbed his briefcase and duffel bag, and ran for the gate. The agent handed him his boarding pass, quickly explaining that a group of four who checked in remotely hadn't shown up, so seats were given to those on standby. Max hurried onto the plane and realized he had scored a first-class seat, a good sign, he thought. Settling into his seat, he felt that things might actually go his way. As they taxied to the runway, he ordered another gin and tonic, thinking he had earned it, then fell asleep, dreaming of a new future with enough money to always fly first class. The shock of landing woke him up. Eventually, he got to the taxi stand and took a cab home. He'd driven his pickup truck to the airport days earlier, but now he was tired, a bit tipsy, and it was way too late to ask Camilla to come pick him up. They lived a few miles outside Charlotte, so the cab ride was long enough for him to doze off again. The driver had to wake him when they arrived. Max paid, added a generous tip, and, a bit sluggish, stepped out. It had been a long, busy day, and he was already imagining cozying up in bed with Camilla. But as the cab pulled away and he turned toward the house, what he saw froze him in his tracks. A gold Mercedes was parked in the driveway in front of his side of the garage. It was a very stylish Mercedes, but then again, all Mercedes seemed stylish to him. The house was dark, it was past midnight, and Max just stood there, shocked. He'd spoken to Camilla from his lawyer's office around noon, and she hadn't mentioned any late-night visitors. Trying to stay calm, he walked slowly toward the door, through the passage between the garage and the house, unlocked it, and entered the quiet home. Moving carefully, he walked through the kitchen, and up the stairs toward his and Camilla's bedroom. The bedroom door was open, apparently not expecting company, and Max stepped inside. And then, it happened. His mind stopped working, he couldn't breathe, even his heart seemed to freeze. He saw what he considered unthinkable. Camilla lay naked, sprawled out on her side of the bed, her arm wrapped around a man who was also asleep, even smiling slightly in his sleep. Max stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. His mind started working again, and he looked down at Camilla's hand lying on the man as they both snored. This broke Max's heart. Until that night, he'd enjoyed listening to Camilla's soft snoring. It meant she felt safe, deep in a peaceful sleep beside him. Now, he'd never hear that snoring again, never sleep beside her again. Even with his heart shattered, Max's thoughts started to come together. He saw the man's clothes neatly folded on the chair Max had sat on hundreds of times, and a smoldering rage began to stir within him. He could get the tennis racket out of the closet and beat the man with it. He could even hit Camilla. Both would be satisfying, but the long-term consequences wouldn't be worth it. Then, another idea began to form. He took out his phone, snapped a few photos as evidence, and collected all of the man's clothes and shoes. The man was big, at least 4 or 5 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier than Max, who stood at 15 and weighed about 160 pounds. Even a tennis racket might not have been enough to handle him. Holding the clothes and shoes, Max took one last look at his wife, his once beloved Camilla, mother of his precious daughters, and hardened his heart. He left the bedroom without tears and walked back down the stairs, stepping outside. He clicked the key fob, and the Mercedes doors opened. He tossed his briefcase and bag inside, and slid into the driver's seat. Max had never been a fan of luxury cars, but sitting inside the Benz, he found he liked it. He figured out the controls, put the car in gear, and drove off. After about a mile, Max pulled over and looked at the man's wallet. Inside were the usual things: some cash, business cards that identified him as Franklin Thompson, a senior sales manager at a local Mercedes dealership, and a driver's license listing a Charlotte address. If Franklin had a family, Max knew he could create real trouble. But at that moment, Max was exhausted, so he headed to the nearest motel to get some sleep. Meanwhile, Camilla was at home, not realizing Max had returned. The next morning, Franklin asked her about his missing clothes and car. They eventually came to the grim realization that Max had likely seen them together. Panicked, they discussed calling the police, but worried it would reveal the affair. Max, meanwhile, drove to Franklin's house using the address from the license, hoping to confront him. When he arrived, a young woman, likely Franklin's wife, opened the door. After a tense conversation, she let him in. They shared coffee, and Max explained the situation.